The King of the Frogs, African folktale. Have you ever been beside a lake in Africa at night and listened to the frogs? You haven't? Then you cannot imagine what the noise is like. And it's not just one kind of noise. It's several. Over there, for instance, are 1,000 creaking doors that have never had their hinges oiled, and someone opens and shuts them, and keeps on doing just that. Over there are 1,000 fat men snoring, and no one wakes them up. Then there are 1,000 carpenters sawing planks, and all the saws want a touch of grease, and 1,000 little bells are being struck, and 1,000 corks are being pulled out of bottles. Noise! You can hardly hear yourself think. Then you go a little closer until you can just see the edge of the water, and perhaps a reed or two, and there is silence. Just the splash of a frog jumping into the water late because he was asleep and didn't hear you coming. Then nothing, and you can hear the whole world breathe. There's a story about this. Long ago, the frogs did as they pleased, and the result was dreadful. Not one of them would listen to what another said, and they all shouted at once. Children wouldn't obey their parents, and even wives wouldn't listen to their husbands, which is indeed something hardly to be understood. It was all noisy and untidy beyond bearing, and nothing ever got done. At last, a wise old frog called everyone to a meeting, and since he had a very fine voice and went on shouting for long enough, he managed to get them all there at once, for to tell you the truth, they were pretty sick of living the way they did. "Frogs," said the old frog, puffing himself up, "we cannot go on like this. It's no sort of life for anyone, and anyway, when you see how all the other creatures live, it makes one ashamed of being a frog. There's only one thing to do. We must get a king. When people have kings, there is peace and order, and everyone does as he is told." "Agreed," they all shouted, and they stayed long enough to commission the old frog to see what he could do about getting them one, before everybody fell to quarreling and pushing and splashing, and the meeting broke up in disorder, as usual. Then the wise old frog went to see the great god Mumi. You will say the two M's correctly if you hum a little before you begin the word. Mumi happened to be in charge of that part of the world. He is a very slow god, and usually gives people more than they bargain for. He agreed drowsily that the frogs needed a king, and promised to do something about it. Then he went to sleep again. So the frogs went on as usual, which was badly, until one day Mumi woke up, remembered his promise, took a great green mossy boulder which had the rough shape of a gigantic frog, and threw it into the water. Splash! "There you are," he shouted. It sounded like thunder. "There's your king. His name's Gogo, And like me, he doesn't want to be disturbed. Respect him and be satisfied. The whole lake was shaken by Gogo's fall. The waves washed through the reeds and tore up the shore, and in the middle of a great cloud of mud, Gogo settled on the bottom, and the fat green water weeds curled round and over him. He looked shocking. The frogs were terrified and fled under stones and into dark corners and holes under the bank. Their long white legs streaked behind them as they swam. Parents found their children and husbands their wives, and then settled down to explaining what had happened. "This is our king," they said, "and a fine, terrible one he seems, and from the splash he made, not the sort to fool about with. Now all will be well, and this scandalous behavior will stop." And so it did, for a while. But although Gogo had made such a wonderful first impression, as time passed, they noticed that he never moved. He just sat quietly in the mud and stared in the same direction. Presently, they began to get used to him, until finally some young, bold, bad frogs ventured to swim close to him, and then one of them touched his nose. And still, Gogo said and did nothing. "Bah! He's not a king," they shouted. "He's not even a frog. He's just an old stone and couldn't hurt anyone." And they swam round him until they were dizzy and jumped all over his back and went away and spoke rudely about him to their elders. At first, none of the elders believed them. They had told their children Gogo was a king, and a king he had to be, but soon it was impossible to deny that the children were right, and then, well, the noise began again, and things were as they had always been, only worse. Terrible! The wise old frog sighed and set out to see Umumi again, who was not at all pleased at being woken a second time. "All right," he shouted in a passion. "All right. You aren't satisfied with the king I've given you. Is that the way it is? Very well, you shall have another, and I hope you like him." And the very next night, he gave them Mamba, the crocodile. Gogo had come to his people with a splash that shook the lake, but Mamba slid into the water with only a whisper, and left but one small ring spreading gently to show that he had come. Then he swam, silent as a shadow, lithe and long and secret, his jaws grinning like a trap. Gogo had never visited the people he had been given to rule, but Mamba visited them often and suddenly, and whenever he met a subject, the great jaws gaped and closed, and often it was the last of that frog. The frogs developed the greatest respect for their new king and lived quietly, looking over the backs of their heads as frogs can. Now and again at night they break out, but they keep their ears open. And if you go near the lake, they shut up. They think that it's Mamba coming to put a little order into them, and they keep quiet.